Yo, what's happening? Don, good to see you.
It's good to see you. You've been sort of on a hiatus since the last time we got together.
Yeah, there's been a lot happening. My side 3 months with no power, you relocating. So I'm glad to be back here, back on it.
Absolutely. Since we were gone, building Team Human has taken a real step backwards. I think we're kind of moving in the wrong direction, but great. I got it. We're just getting started here.
We sort of had the consistency, then we had some delays, but at least we still come back,
Well, I didn't mean
we didn't let drop the goal.
I didn't mean just the show. I meant the concept of building Team Human. It seems as a world we're moving in the wrong direction. So that's why I'm sure we're gonna get this thing sorted out and get it back on the right track.
100%. 100%. So yeah, let's jump straight into it. Don, you can go ahead with the introduction.
Yeah, I'm just, really, really pleased to have Ed on today. Ed is a friend of mine, personal friend of mine, and also a remarkable man with all kinds of international background, working in the Canadian Forces largely, but he's also been retired for quite a while. And, he continues his work in international development. He continues to work in Cameroon with an NGO that he founded that is primarily concerned with building schools and promoting education, particularly in the conflict areas of Cameroon, which a lot of people don't know about. But there's a secessionist movement among the English provinces, and of course it's a predominantly French-speaking country. I'm sure Ed can speak much more to that. But I just learned recently that when Ed was in Europe with the Canadian Forces, he also worked in Romania in the Ceausescu orphanages, which we all know the horrible stories about. But also for 4 years, he worked in South Sudan, during the worst of that conflict. And so Ed, despite all kinds of reasons to be completely frozen and paralyzed by the trauma and anger and hatred he's seen, continues to work for a better world. In fact, he just got back from Cameroon the other day. So anyway, it's just a real pleasure to have Ed on. And Ed, we do this sort of every time just to kind of get ourselves started, and then I'm going to kind of turn it over to you. But Langston Hughes wrote a poem that I think is both poignant and very, very topical. He says, "I'm so tired of waiting, aren't you, for the world to become good and beautiful and kind. Let us take a knife and cut the world in two and see what worms are eating at the rind." So we wanted, just kind of use that as a metaphor, but also as a launching pad to you. Ed, you've seen a lot. You've been a lot of places. What's eating at the world? What's keeping us from coming together as Team Human to combat the problems we face universally? What's breaking us up into warring tribes instead of a common humanity?
Can I just interject for a second? Maybe let's give the introduction,
Okay, good point.
Yeah. So the listeners, have a brief background about it.
Yeah, sorry, Ed, I jumped in, but you tell us a little bit about yourself that I didn't.
Sure. So first of all, Kino, Don, good to be here with both of you, and thanks for the invite. I actually have been looking forward to this. So yeah, a little bit about myself, and I think much of it is captured there on the screen. I did serve 25 years in the Canadian military. I retired in 2011, so I've been retired for almost 15 years now. I retired early. I did a 25-year career, but I could have stayed much longer. But I retired because I wanted to get on with much of this all of this stuff that I was exposed to in the military just made me want to have more latitude and more freedom for taking my life in a direction that I felt was more worthy of my time, if I can put it that way. I'm not trying to be at all critical, because I loved my time in the military. However, I do want to define that a little bit, because I did love my time in the military, but I joined in the 1980s when Canada was globally well known and well respected as a peacekeeping military institution, military force. And I remember, because I joined as an officer, I had to write an essay to during the recruitment phase of it all. And I don't know how they graded that essay. I didn't get feedbacks or anything like that, but I think they were looking more for a window inside my mind. The subject matter that they gave you was, why do you want to join the military? And you had to write a 1,000-word essay on it. I don't specifically remember the 1,000 words, but I do remember the theme of that essay. And for me, it was because it was about Canada being such a great, as I understood it as a young 20-year-old, a great force for peace in the world, and being such a highly respected peacekeeping nation, and how I wanted to be a part of that. Looking back, it was maybe a little bit naive. I mean, of course, Canada was a great peacekeeping nation, but the whole concept of peacekeeping, I have learned, is not exactly what idealists would like to. It's not exactly where it should be, where it could be, is according to me. And that's after serving with the UN and being in some of these places. Of course, I'm proud of it all. I'm proud of my service, but I'm also just as happy to be outside and be in full control of my life, and be able to dedicate my time where I feel it's getting the most returns. So yeah, I mean, let me give you my family, because that's of course important. I have a wife, Margaret, and 3 kids and 4 grandkids who are actually visiting with me this weekend with their dogs. So if it does get a little bit noisy, I'll mute my microphone at that point.
And if I could just break in, you also come from a family of defiance and courage and desire for justice and independence, and that you're a descendant of escaped slaves. And my understanding is that Harriet Tubman was instrumental in helping them get to Canada. Is that right?
Yeah, it is. For me, it's a big part of how I vision myself, because we have always known our family legacy. So my family's been in Canada since the 1850s. We did come up through the underground, what was called the Underground Railroad, which was had nothing to do with a train running underground, but of course it was an underground network of safe houses and routes and guides who would assist any slaves who were enslaved in America and who were seeking freedom. And all they had to do, I say all they had to do, like it was some simple thing, but what they had to do was get into Canada. Once they crossed that international line, their freedom was guaranteed. And so my family benefited from that Underground Railroad system. Our family church here in St. Catharines is a church built by freedom seekers, as we call them now. Escaped slaves is what maybe people understand it, helps people to understand, but the term that they use now is freedom seekers, because it's all about, we were never slaves, even if we were forced into it. But we were always freedom seekers. And so the church that was built, and my family was part of it all, was built by freedom seekers, because even though they were free in Canada, of course, they weren't all completely, there was still racism. They had to have their own churches and their own schools and their own neighborhoods, but at least they were free to thrive to the extent as possible. And that background is core to my family as a whole. We're all very much aware of We don't know where in Africa our family is, although I need to caveat that, because actually we do have a pretty good idea now, because we have done DNA tracing. So we know the region of Africa that we come from, but we don't know the families there or anything like that. But yeah, it's been foundational to forming all of us in my family, and how we think of the world.
And the fact that you think of the world rather than, just your locality, although you've also been very active in your local and regional political attempts to find justice, but it does, I think it gives you that special global perspective that informs everything you do. But if we could just move to the experiences you had, I mean, I imagine that sense of that desire for peace and freedom is what led you, as you suggested, into the military in the first place. But then you found yourself in some pretty incredible situations: Sudan, South Sudan, later Cameroon. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Sure, I can. So I guess for me, and it's something that it's what I wanted to do when I joined the military. I really wanted to be involved in. I remember when I went to South Sudan, and my unit, where I was stationed here in Canada, was getting taskings from higher headquarters saying, it's time for some of your people to be deployed overseas. And then there's options for people to say, oh, I'd like to do this, or I'd like to do it. It doesn't mean you're going to get what you asked for. In the end, the military is going to send you where they want you to be. But they do, at least in the Canadian military, they did seek your thoughts on what you'd like to do. And at the time, the main driver, the thing that most of my colleagues were really interested in doing was in Afghanistan, and which was just, I'm going to say, it was a war. I mean, it was a war. I want to say, I want to be careful here, because I completely honor all of those desires that they had to get over there and fight what they saw as a terrorist movement that needed to be stopped and things like that. But I had internal struggle with some of it, not because I'm somehow sympathetic to a terrorist movement, but because it just wasn't, Afghanistan for some reason wasn't black and white in my mind. You don't get that luxury to decide in the military, and I understand that. But I remember saying to my commanding officer, I would rather go to South Sudan as a peacekeeper than go to Afghanistan on a war mission if it's left up to me. If I can influence it in any way, I'd rather be in South Sudan. It was not the preferred location for many in the military, because all of the energy was going into Afghanistan, and going to South Sudan was what we called an unsupported position, meaning you're going as one person. You're not going with a Canadian contingent of support around you and logistics and medical support and everything else. You're going as one person to join a UN attachment over there. And let's say it was not as attractive, but for me, it was hugely attractive. I said, no, if I can take the South Sudan, send me to South Sudan. Fortunately for me, I got sent to South Sudan, and I got sent at a very critical time for that nation. In that, so I say I got sent to South Sudan. I actually got sent to Sudan. There was no South Sudan at the time, but the comprehensive peace agreement had been signed. And now they were in the referendum stage of deciding, is the country going to divide or not? And they were doing popular vote. And that in and of itself is a contentious time. Emotions are elevated at times like that when these huge political votes are being held, and the future of the country is potentially at stake. And so I got to be there and in fact, when I was in South Sudan, that's when I decided I'm leaving the military, because the military would have left me there for 6 or 9 months and then repatriated me back to Canada, and I would have been expected to get on with some other duties. And it was when I was there, I realized I can't leave this place. I felt very effective at what I was able to do, and I felt very comfortable. And I was actually in South Sudan when I notified my commanding officer back in Canada that upon my return to Canada, I would be leaving the military so that I could get back to South Sudan and continue.
So when you say that you were very effective in what you could do, what could you do? I mean, I think for most of us, the image of South Sudan during that period is just utter chaos. The gingerweed the murders and massacres, villages being burned. I mean, is that an accurate perspective?
It is accurate. Now, I don't want to make it seem though like it was raging all around, but the tensions and the possibilities were still there. And certainly many times out on patrol, the gun battles would break out. However, to identify clearly what my role was, I wasn't carrying a weapon, and it wasn't my role to engage in any battle, and I never did. My role was to keep my head down at times like that, like if I was there. And there were certainly times when, so if my official designation was UN military observer. So, there was a UN base and my job was to leave the base and go into the environment and establish networks and dialogues and contacts and get assessments of where are the people, what is their humanitarian conditions, what's the political tensions, is there going to be fighting in a certain area. So I'd go out on patrols for anywhere from 4 to 10 days out into we say out into the bush, if that's not a derogative term. We were going out into the bush for 4 to 10 day patrols. And the idea was make contact with people, find out what's going on out there, and come back and write your reports and input your reports into the UN system.
But you're also working in those communities to resolve conflicts, to deal with violence, to build communities. Is that not right?
In a way, I want to say that my role in the UN was not to resolve conflict. I could dynamically, if something, and these are low-level conflict. This is not political level discussions I'm in. This is village against village. There's anger because of, it's always a struggle about resources. There's not enough water. They want their cattle to drink. It's always about resources. So yes, absolutely. Because I did have what I considered good relationships with the local leaderships, the traditional leaderships, the sultans and the Payam directors and things like this. I had a role to play in those discussions, but it's not really where I felt I was most effective. And many times, well, let me say at least 2 or 3 times, when tensions were building, and I would be trying to talk in you use your de-escalation skills, if you will, and things. And then finally someone looks at you and says, Smith, you have no role here. Leave. And you don't have an option at that time. You don't have any enforcement capability. You don't have a weapon, nor did I want a weapon. You've done what you can, and they're offering you the chance to leave now. And if you're smart, you take that chance. You take that opportunity and you leave, because everything you've tried has not worked. And there's going to be something is going to happen here. And I don't want to say that that's where I got my sense of actually being effective, because that was discouraging more than anything. I realized that there are long held, coming in as an outsider, it's rare that they look at you and say, oh, you have something wise to add to this or something. So I honestly don't assess that. I mean, I tried, like everybody tries, like all good intentioned people in the UN system. I have my complaints about the UN system. I'm sure we could go a whole program on that. But somewhere, sure.
Why are you on the UN? Why are you there? Okay, for educational purposes for the listeners, the UN is the United Nations. Ed, can you briefly explain the role of the United Nations for listeners?
So it really depends on where in the world. I mean, if we go in a macro level, of course, the United Nations is all about all of the things that we'd like to think a United Nations would be about, and that is the guarantee of basic human rights globally on a global scale, and it has a few ways of. I'm going to say not guaranteeing, because there never is a guarantee, but helping to achieve those human rights. They create a lot of policy, international policy, that is just idealistic in nature, but it sets goals for nations, to achieve, as far as if you want to move up what's called the Human Development Index, the measure of how you are as far as becoming part of a positive part of Team Human, then you try to achieve a series of goals established by the United Nations. And of course, the United Nations is basically all nations of the world that sign on to these agreements. This is not just a few people working in isolation. So they set lofty goals for humanity to reach, goals that could be basic primary education for all children of the world, basic health care for all people of the world, very lofty goals that all nations should be striving for.
And Ed, if I can just break in here, if you go on to United Nations, I think it's called Human Rights. I think there's 12 of them. It's really worth looking at because they're lofty, but they're the kind of aspirations that Team Human needs to embrace.
Right. And they're called the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. And they are worth a read if nobody's ever read them. They were originally called the MDGs, which was the Millennium Development Goals. So the goal in the 1980s and 90s was that all nations will achieve these goals by the year 2000. So they called them the MDGs. Then the year 2000 came, and there was no way that that all nations were going to achieve those goals. So they had to relabel them because it's too late to achieve the MDGs. The year 2000 is come and gone. So now they're called the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. So another way, of course, that the UN contributes toward the achievement of these goals is by not just creating the policies, but creating the operational mechanisms that can help nations who are not able to work very positively towards those goals in and of their own resources. So let's say some of the, I struggle with the terminology all the time, but let's say lesser developed. And I hate saying that because it's almost a pejorative term. But I don't know another way to communicate it.
No, that was, anyone could understand, now what's the mandate of the United Nations. Don is probably going to laugh at me with this next question. So Donald Trump, with his latest speech at the UN, he, not in just words, but he says the UN is causing more problems than solving issues around the world. So I want to integrate that into creating Team Human. If the goal for the UN is to sort of, at a macro level, accomplish the goal we are attempting to accomplish with this podcast and creating Team Human, would you agree or disagree with Donald Trump's statement?
Yeah, I find it hard to agree with much that Donald Trump says. And I certainly I certainly disagree with him. I do understand there is this underlying, and even people in the UN that I worked with anyway, nobody hides from this fact that the UN has problems. Like any big organization or big institution, you can identify inefficiencies, you can identify bad actors, or I mean, when we talk about Team Human, that means good and bad. I mean, so the UN has problems, and I would be one of the most vocal critics of the UN. But I think what matters in critique is the intent. So, you know, if it's constructive criticism, that's one thing. If it's destructive criticism, then you better bring your proofs and you better bring a better system, because I can't imagine the world without a UN. Of course, we can all imagine that, but what I mean is it would be much worse off without a UN. So as much as I have criticisms about the UN and I say, oh, in the Canadian military, we would do it this way and it's much more efficient and blah, blah, blah. Like I can sit there and make all these criticisms in dialogue with them. But it's where you're coming from when you do this. So if you're coming from let's say a spot of good faith, of really hoping that you can engage in dialogue that will change things, well, you need criticism. And it's a huge organization. And it's trying to please 200 member states, you know, like how do you do that? So it's shackled by some really restrictive rules for reform. And I'm glad it's not up to me to resolve. Let me just put it.
But at the same time, Ed, following up on what you're saying, it's also the only, I think fair to say, international organization that is mandated to address the fundamental challenges facing humanity, whether it's climate change, whether it's refugees, whether it's global. I mean, we have how many conflicts raging right now? And my understanding was, I mean, that certainly I know that the United Nations peacekeeping forces have been very effective and not in helping to stabilize conflicts, regional conflicts. So again, the cynicism of Trump reflects to me his complete lack of global perspective and his lack of understanding of, or his disdain for international action and collaboration, which is what Team Human is all about. I mean, I guess after listening to him, I'm thinking, yeah, I guess about the closest thing we can come to Team Human right now is the United Nations, as ineffective as it is, as flawed as it is.
Right. And I think Trump has displayed to the world that he is not a builder. He is a destructive force. And so I think we would all breathe easier if, like, I have no problem if a world leader wants to criticize the United Nations. But again, like I said, criticize it constructively. Say, you know, we need change. The United Nations is ineffective in this area or that area or whatever. And we're here to say we will help that change happen. We'll lead a subcommittee on this and that, or whatever is needed. And that's all good. But you get to recognize a force that is just there for purely negative reasons and just to wreak havoc and flex their muscles and cause destruction. And that's all bad. And so, yeah, I'm not a cheerleader for the United Nations. Like, well, I guess I am, because overall, I would say the world needs the United Nations to exist. Yeah, changes need to happen, but the world is far better off with the United Nations than without it.
Ed, if I could go back to one of your earlier comments about conflict in South Sudan, you said it always comes down to resources. Could I ask you to broaden that a little bit and go to sort of the theme? You know, the premise is that really the only way forward is to break down the tribalism, the divisions that separate us, and find a common humanity that allows us to combine our energies and our skills to overcome these existential problems that we're facing. I guess I had two questions. Do you think that's possible? And secondly, what's keeping us from achieving that?
So let me bring that back, because when you sent me before the show, you sent me the that small poem that you read, and I read it and I put some thought into it. And I have to say, I'm not an optimist on the fate of humanity. I'm just not. I'm not in a positive spot. I want to be, but I think that the forces that are winning at this particular moment in history are the forces, the destructive. Let me be extremely dramatic here. Let me say the destructive evil forces are currently winning the day in the world. And so we have these things going on that should be so easily resolved. There is no reason for any of this mess that we see in the world to be going on except human ego. You know, whether it's Israel, Gaza, Ukraine, Russia, Sudan, South Sudan, Myanmar, these are human induced disasters. This is not like if there was a global drought and we were all suffering around the world because we can't feed ourselves because we've had nothing but drought around the world for 2 years, and all we can do is struggle to get through. That's one thing. This is not that. If we had good faith, reasonable even leadership around the world, there's no reason that most of humanity could be thriving. And it is the faults of the human ego, the human personality. I don't know what it is, but it's human fault. And I don't see any global leadership that inspires vision or hope. I see small stuff, like even this program. I see small people like the three of us sitting here and talking about things that we wish would happen or things that need to happen. And I can identify 100 small little community champions out there. Maybe that's where the hope lies. But you look at the problems of global warming and the wars and the nationalistic policies of the various power brokers of the world right now and everything. And I don't know how we overcome this. But having said that, because I express this freely to anybody that talks to me, don't look to me for optimism in the world. And then people say, then why don't you just spend your retirement golfing or fishing? And I say, no, that's not an option either. Like, just because you think you're not going to win the fight, if the fight is noble, you have to fight it. It's a fight that has to be engaged in. And when I say fight, I mean exactly this program you're doing. I'm not talking about pick up your arms and pick up your arms and your pitchforks and your machetes and let's get into the streets. I'm talking about you got to keep trying. You just got to stay engaged and keep trying. But I'm beyond the point of convincing myself that I will live to see a better world. I think it's going to get a lot worse before it gets better, but I'll go down fighting on the right side.
It reminds me, and I may have already mentioned this on this show, but one of my favorite books is One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, where Randall McMurphy is the only guy. He's in an insane asylum ward for the insane. He's the only one who's not there with a mental illness, and he realizes that all these guys have locked themselves, have signed themselves into this ward. They could leave anytime they want, but they don't. And so he's to show his frustration, he tries to pick up this giant sink in the middle. He said, I'm going to pick this up and throw it through the window so you can all get out of here. I said, you can't pick that up. That's 400 pounds. And he says, just watch me. And he takes bets. I'm going to do this. And of course, he grabs it and his muscles tense. And he tries to pick it up and nothing happened. They say, we knew you couldn't do it. So I'm just getting warmed up. And he grabs it again. And this time they can hear it sort of crunching a little bit, moving a little bit. It's like it's starting to lift. And then he puts it down. And not possible. And said, we knew you couldn't do it. And he said, yeah, but I tried, goddammit. At least I did that much. I'll never forget that line. And I think that's about, to me, where we have to go right now. All we can do is try. And to not try, I think, is a betrayal of ourselves and certainly of humanity.
I couldn't agree with you more. And I don't want to be one of those people who says, well, you know what? I'll get through this life okay. I can go golfing and fishing and just spend my life in leisure and close my eyes to what's actually going on all around me. And I don't, it's tough because you don't want to criticize people who everybody has their own life going on, their own issues to deal with. And I'm not saying I have a window into what everybody should be doing with their life. I can only speak for what I know I should be doing with my life. And it is not going golfing or spending my retirement years in leisure. And I think it's okay. Like, I'm not seeking joy. I used to attend here a Socratic, I'm going to say, discussion group where they would sit in a circle and the facilitator of the group would just put out a very profound question of the night. And the answer, the idea was to just discuss the issue. And this is maybe 10 years ago, let me say. And I remember one night, of course, there's that question that all of us as humans deal with. What's the purpose of life? And so that's going to be the question of the night, one of these nights. And it was. And I was surprised at, maybe I shouldn't have been surprised, but the number of people who said, I just want to be happy and I want my kids to be happy and I want my grandkids to be happy. And I guess that's ingrained in us, and I guess that's normal, but I was surprised because happiness has never been on my list. And I don't know, like, for me, and because I was sitting silent, the facilitator tried to draw me in and said, Ed, we're not hearing from you and all this. I don't agree with anything that's been said, because the whole discussion was about happiness and, well, what does happiness mean? And does it mean free of disease? Does it mean this and that? That's like, so it was, it evolved into a discussion of happiness, and we all want happiness. Happiness isn't even on my list. I want a sense of purpose. I want to wake up and I don't care if I'm angry, as long as it's an anger based in righteous indignation. I'm not talking about being angry and miserable. I'm talking about being angry at the world, being angry. This is not right. We need to change things. And waking up every morning fueled with that is far more meaningful to me.
So you're replacing happiness with a meaningful life. That
meaningful to me. And I don't disregard that for someone else, the pursuit of happiness can be meaningful. And people talk about joy and things like this. And I love getting into these talks because I say, well, what is that? 1 minute you feel joy and you're on this high point. And it can be for some people just because they purchase something new and they get that chemical rush in the brain that makes them happy for the next 3 hours because they have a new shiny whatever it is. But how long does that last? And then you're back down to normal or maybe even subnormal. Because happiness or joy or those feelings
are transient.
Right. They come and they go. And what does it mean to pursue that?
I want to go to one of the points Kino made right from the beginning of planning this show was not just kind of talking about it in happiness in a circle, but acting on our beliefs. Acting, we don't want to just say, gee, it'd be nice if we could have Team Human. but also talking about strategies for achieving it. And I think, it's one thing to say you want to be happy and you want your grandkids to be happy, but what do you need to do? That's not going to happen without effort, without strategy. I mean, your grandkids aren't going to be happy if the world's melting, or melted at that point. So, what that was your concern, right?
Yeah, that's what we telephonically spoke about last week, Saturday, when we were talking about the assassination of Charlie Kirk. And my comment was, when I go on social media and I see all these haters of Charlie Kirk, posting about he was this, he was that, and giving their sad stories. But my argument to these people is, have you ever looked at what Charlie Kirk actually did right? He had his beliefs. He had his ideologies. He actually went out and made it public. He started small, but he went out one scan at a time, one college at a time, and he shared his views publicly, loudly, proudly. So if you got a concern about something that's happening in the world, you need to do that. You can't hide behind the curtains. You can't hide behind the curtains or post on social media, oh, he's this, oh, yeah, this in Gaza, oh, and his views on this. You can't do that. It's not enough. Us recording this podcast, me posting it, creating reels out of it, marketing it is not enough. If you have a view on something, you need to go out there, start small, one table at a time, engage in dialogue with your community, be loud and proud about your beliefs. You can't just hide behind the curtains. It's not going to work. We got more complainers in society than doers. But the ones that are actually doing, as you said, Ed, the disruptive powers of the world, they go out loud and proud about their beliefs. And that's how they continue to get a larger following day by day. Because nobody else knows better, has seen better, has heard anybody else talking passionately better.
Right.
So, of course, they're going to follow, a Donald Trump, or they're going to follow the Charlie Kirk. And look, I'm not biased, but this is the reality of the matter. Going on social media and posting about a concern is not enough. For me, you're just someone who's trying to get some sort of attention, get more vanity metrics, more likes, and not enough. You really have to get out there.
I couldn't agree with you more. And when you talk about the leadership, I even think back to my military days. So I was an officer. I retired at the rank of major, and I remember. So as an officer, actually, any individual in the military is expected to display leadership. Doesn't matter what your rank is. Leadership is just a core value of the Canadian military, and I'm sure of militaries all around the world. And I remember, so you're always supposed to be practicing and honing your skills in leadership, but also observing. I mean, one of the best ways to hone your skills is to critique other people in leadership positions and say, well, I wouldn't have done that, or I really like the way he or she did that. And if you're thinking critically and you're observant, you're able to internalize this stuff and make yourself better at it. And I remember identifying leaders that I thought, that person is brilliant, and I would follow that person anywhere. And not blindly. I'm saying they'd been washed right through my mind critically. So it's not blind leadership or followership. It is very, they'd been washed right through my mind and say, that person is someone I could easily follow for the next 20 years of my life. Mm-hmm. And who in the world of politics is doing that for us right now? And I just struggle for that. And maybe I'm overly, let's say, nostalgic or romantic, because I go back to figures that were important to me, and that's the Nelson Mandelas and the Martin Luther Kings, and these people of virtue and resistance, and saying things are wrong, and I'm calling it out, and I'm standing up whatever the price is. I think humanity has gotten so distracted by this corporate world that we've created that those who are really in control now know that all you have to do, if that level of good leadership starts to stick its head out of the sand, they know how to cut it off very quickly. Like it's struggling to make itself known. Like look at what they did. Let me give you what I think is a perfect example. Greta Thunberg, the young environmental activist from, I think she's from Sweden. And there she was, a 17-year-old girl doing visionary stuff and just marking her line in the sand and saying, climate change has got to, we need positive actions around the world. A global movement was starting centered on her actions, and a global movement of support. And just as quickly, a global movement to undermine her and to criticize. A 17-year-old and fully grown adults in the fully developed Western world were criticizing her and insulting her in a way that is just unimaginable, but in a way that was very effective and turned her almost into a laughing stock with so many people in the world. How do you have hope in a humanity that endorses that? That people got behind that and said, yeah, Greta Thunberg, she's a joke. I don't know what the answer is.
But Ed, I think that's a really good example. Because she's still there. And we just saw her now on the flotilla to Gaza. And that sophisticated attack on her to undermine her credibility, it was shocking in its extent, its sophistication, its funding, and yet she remains one of the few figures that not only spoke out, as we've been talking about, rather than just posting on Facebook, but put her life literally on the line. And I think she continues to be a beacon of an example of what we can be. But it goes back to what you said earlier. What are we willing to risk? What are we willing to give up? Right now, I see people folding, including like giant media in the United States, not out of real threats, but apprehension of loss, concern for loss. Sometimes it's just financial loss. I mean, it's not even, it's like, oh my goodness, I don't want to risk that. It might make me less happy. I might not be able to afford as many things. So I think it's like, what are we willing to risk to speak out? Not only, and to Kino's point, not just speak out, but to act out. And I'm at this point, I think there's a whole lot of people who harbor better ideas, better impulses, but who have been convinced that to act on those is risky. And I don't know quite how we get beyond that.
You have to go full in. This is not a part-time gig. If this is your calling in life, this is not a part-time gig. You have to be willing to put your life on the line in order to make a difference in the world. As the quote goes, you have to do what's right, what's not popular.
Right.
So you have to put your life on the line. You have to give it all up. I mean, Don, we haven't spoken that much, over the last 3 months, with your health and the relocations and the power outages that I was experiencing in South Africa. But my mandate, with all the shows and the podcasts that I'm on and how verbal I am about my opinions, whether it be on Creating Team Human or The Greatest Space, with the Isaac podcast, but I get targeted a lot, a lot. Whether it's verbal, whether it's online, whether it's emails, but this just comes with the life you choose, you know, and you just have to push it aside, and you still have to just keep going, you know. Your
The one
beliefs.
thing I would say to that, Kino, too, is that I think people have to evaluate and understand that this equation is true, that with great risk, there is also great reward. And that's true even in this, in that, like I said, I'm a pessimist, that I'm not saying I'm going to live to see the world that I want to have in my lifetime. It's not going to happen. However, I don't want anybody to think that somehow I lead a very unrewarded life. I'm very, uh, um, I don't want to say happy because that's not the word, but
Fulfilled.
I'm doing exactly what I'm meant to do, and I would not change it into something else. And so it's not like, even though you don't believe you're going to win, it's not like you're walking around in depression and wondering what's the value of my life. There's great value for me in what I do. And I don't even consider myself a fighter, really. Like I express my opinion. Anybody who asks for it, and if someone could identify the leader that I should follow, who's going to get us to that promised land, I'm ready to jump on that bandwagon. But I'm just not seeing the bandwagon yet.
Larry, Ed, I mean, with all due respect, yeah, you express your opinion when you're asked, but you also express it when you're not asked. And I mean that with real respect, because you are willing to speak out. You are willing to take the risk. You are willing to stand in front of a city council and call them the fools that they are, and to call out the destruction that they're causing to people at the community level, the hardships. I mean, that. And I've seen you do it, and you do it well. And so I think that give yourself credit. And if we all could find that in ourselves, to take those risks, it's no fun to stand up in front of a city council and have to harangue them, to tell them that that they are giving money to billionaires and millionaires and depriving people who need it. It's not fun to do that, especially when they attack you. And I know the kind of attacks you receive. So I mean, I think that, you are in many ways, I'm talking about microcosm of what we could be. I mean, you're not a Greta Thunberg, no offense, but I mean, you are at a local and to an extent a national level, a leader, and you are showing, you're modeling the kind of things we could do, and without sort of like, I don't know, like, becoming an aesthetic and selling everything we have except for a loincloth. I mean, you're showing what we can do, what we can be as members of Team Human, to find the bridges, to call truth to power, to build bridges and relationships. I mean, that's what you're doing, and it seems to me that is all we really can do, and particularly when we have a whole lot of forces out there who are arrayed against it. All we can do is keep trying and doing what we can. And it's really a delight to have you on and listen to you today, because despite us knowing each other, we haven't really had this kind of discussion. And it's really interesting to me.
Well, thanks, Todd, and I agree. But I'll say this: you've been in those trenches with me, and yes, and I do believe that everything is local. Like, really, let's say, and Kino, I don't know that much about you as far as at what level of politics you're connected and able to influence. But for the majority of people around the world, your sphere of influence is very small and very local. But that just influence what you can in your sphere, and watch how, as you start to influence what you can in your sphere, watch how that sphere starts to grow. It's not that it will stay small if you're serious about trying to influence. So yeah, none of us, I assume, none of us in this dialogue is ever going to influence Donald Trump or the United Nations or even the Prime Minister of Canada. Don, like you and me are here in Canada, I don't think we're ever going to influence political discourse in Canada. But we all have our spheres of influence. Everybody does. And if we can commit to trying to engage in those, no matter how small they are, in those personal spheres of influence, maybe that one leader who can galvanize it all will emerge. I don't know.
Well, that's the power of podcasting in 2025 and in the future to come, is because of these decentralized platforms, we've got more reach than ever. We may not have billions in funding yet, to market the shows that we are actually on. But, there's a lot of advantage and pros right now in this era that we're living in. After this recording is done and it's uploaded, and as I said before, the reels that are created after that, and, how I posted and using my knowledge with social media to get that reach, even on one reel, if I can get over 100 people to view that reel of what Ed has just said, it's adding to this mandate, it's getting there. I have no intention of wanting to influence a political leader or political party. Like, I honestly stay away from politics as far as possible. Unfortunately, it has to come up, on the shows.
Right.
In order for us to get our message across. But how I feel is that I'm going to accomplish this by influencing the masses rather than influencing the politicians. I'm not going to win there. No ways. But if I influence the masses and I get more people to view the content online, and I interact with people on the street and community, on podcasts that I'm invited to be on, or the subject comes on, onto another podcast I'm on that has nothing to do with politics, that's where I'm at. People are becoming more and more awakened. That's one good thing that is actually happening in the world today. People are starting to think, for themselves. And that's what I want to accomplish. I want more people to start thinking for themselves. Even when I'm focused in the creative space, whether it be the book industry or whether it be the music industry on that podcast. But, my mandate there is to get more independent creators to start thinking for themselves and start eliminating all the middlemen in between that we had in the past. And in this case, the middleman is all these politicians that we have in the way.
Oh, sorry.
Okay.
Well, Ed, why don't you wind it up with your sort of last thoughts?
Okay, well, let me quickly just add to what Kino said, because I couldn't agree more. And the importance of what we would have in the military called influence activities, which is about, so maybe a kinder way of saying it, again, going back to my military training, was hearts and minds. So, we would go and I remember it was a very specific and directed part of my training before I went on international deployments, that you are trying to win the hearts and the minds of the people. It's not about an overwhelming show of force, which seems to be all that's on display anymore in the world. But it's about influencing. It's about influence activities, and that sounds nefarious, and in the wrong hands it can be. But if you're trying to influence, like you're trying to do, this a force for good, a force for humanity, and the first, I cannot quote you the statistics. I remember being taught them back in my, when I was being taught this stuff in the military, but they would talk about how difficult it is to remove a thought from someone's mind once they've adopted it and said, okay, I accept this as reality. And it may not be reality. And so now you come along and you have to say, no, I'm telling you what you're believing or what you think is reality is wrong. And now you have to remove that thought and get in some good reality, or that is an order of magnitude so difficult that it's important to get into the minds first with good messaging, with good faith stuff like what I believe you're doing with your podcast and all that. It's critical, because once people are, I want to say programmed, it's very hard. Very hard to erase that program.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
We need to unlearn, you know. That's what we need to do now. Society needs to unlearn everything they have been taught and told, you know, depending how old you are, or your whole life. You need to unlearn that. It's time to re-educate.
And one of the things that we learned, back to our original theme, is fear of the other. And the other are people who doesn't look like us, talk like us, act like us, believe like us, think like us. And so we've been programmed, again, as you say, to fear and not listen or appreciate the other. When those of us who worked and lived global and know how much we have to gain from listening and working with the other, and that the other, they do things very differently, but not necessarily any worse, just differently.
Right.
And those differences can enrich us at such an amazing level.
And
We just get out of hand.
right. Beautiful. And you know what? We can, like, I sit around wherever I am in the world and I watch things that I don't understand what's going on, but I think, isn't that beautiful? I'm like, this is great. Like, I don't understand. Why did you do that? And what's this ceremony or something? And I just find it enriching. I don't want it, you know, unfortunately, the opposite voice is the dominant one right now. The nationalism, the fear of the others, everything you talked about, it is winning the day right now. And there's no progression for our species going down that path.
There's no progression for our species going down that road. And so we've got to change direction.
Yeah.